Now that we've finally done the derivations of the demand and supply curve, we can kind of put them together. And this is when we get something called the market equilibrium. So if we were to think about the market equilibrium, that is kind of the price at which the market sells something and the quantity at which they produce. And this has gone back from the start of time, whereby a baker, all the way back to Adam Smith, when kind of father of economics, he sat there looking at a baker and he was like, well, every day he makes 20 loaves of bread and he sells out all of his loaves of bread. Why doesn't he make more? And the problem was that he started then introducing these ideas to the bakers, and they'd make 25 loaves a day, but the next day they would only sell 20. So the extra 5 that they made would be wasted because no one wanted stale bread. And if they made 19, there would be someone else that would come into the shop being like, well, I want a loaf of bread, and they wouldn't have enough, so they'd lose out on business. And he started to understand the whole market equilibrium. So if we were to put these onto a graph, you'd have your quantity and your price. And as we did, we had our upward sloping supply and our downward sloping demand. This value here would be, let's call it P star, would be the equilibrium price. And this quantity here, let's call it Q star, would be the equilibrium quantity. That's how much the market makes, and the equilibrium price, or the market clearing price, is the amount at which those products are sold for. Using this graph, you actually get quite a lot of information. So firstly, let's look at it from a supplier's point of view. You have something called the total revenue. And this is the total amount of money a company makes from selling a good or service. And this would be the price at which they sell it times the quantity at which they sell. So if we were to do that, this red box here would then become the total revenue. So this box here is the total revenue. We can also see some other pretty interesting concepts from the market equilibrium. In terms of, again, if we just very quickly draw a graph, we have the upward sloping supply, the downward sloping demand, we have our equilibrium price, and our equilibrium quantity. Now, if we were to look at the demand and supply, a certain customer here is willing to pay a very high price, but he gets it for what he would see as a discounted price. The next customer is still willing to pay a high price, slightly lower than the first, but he also gets it at a slightly discounted price, and so on. All the way until this customer, who is willing to pay that price and gets it for that price. So every customer before him benefits by this much. So that's why this top part is called the consumer surplus. Every producer as well. So this producer is willing to sell it for a very low price, but he manages to sell it for more. So that's a benefit to it. If you're willing to sell something for $1 but actually end up selling it for 10, that is a benefit to you. And the same concept happens for all of these producers. So this part here is how much the producers benefit. And this is called the producer surplus. Now, the producer and consumer surplus will change depending on the scenarios and things like that as well. But it's a very interesting idea because it shows you how much the consumers are benefiting and how much the producers are benefiting from this. And what we can also see using the market equilibrium is how prices or changes are affected. So, for example, let's look at a certain product whereby it has become very fashionable. So you start off with your initial price and quantity, that's your initial market equilibrium. If it becomes very fashionable, that means a lot of people want it. Let's take the Omega swatch, for example. So demand shifts out. And what happens is actually we see a change in quantity. The quantity moves out, but also the price increases. And that would be the new equilibrium point at Q2, P2. So you can take into account these different shifts and so on. It doesn't mean that just demand or just supply can shift. You can have cases where both of them have shifted, for example. So if we were to look at that, let's say we had a certain type of let's say coffee bean, and we were to be at this point here where it's Q1 P1, and there was a lot of research into this certain coffee bean, and they found that if you were to consume the coffee that it made, you would live till you were 100. So people really wanted this certain coffee bean, so demand shifted out. However, at the same time, there was a massive storm that wiped out a large amount of the farmland used to grow this coffee bean, which would mean that supply would shift inwards. And the new equilibrium is this point where D1 and S1 cross. So maybe the quantity only increases a little bit, but the price has increased massively. Now, it's very difficult to say exactly what happens to quantity because that depends on the amount of the shift. So, for example, if the supply actually hadn't shifted that much, maybe there'd be an increase in quantity, or a more significant increase, or if the demand had shifted more, and so on. So it's very difficult to tell whether there'd actually be an increase or decrease in quantity based on specific graphs, but this might be more visible in different scenarios. So for example, in the first one where only the demand was shifting, you could tell that there'd be a definite increase in quantity. But then it also brings us to the point of, why do we have this equilibrium price? Why can't we just charge whatever we wanted? So to really understand this, we need to look at the market equilibrium. So if we have this quantity Q1 and this price P1. Well, if, let's say we're making laptops or let's say calculators for argument's sake, and if everyone was charging $10 a calculator, you're not suddenly going to start charging $20 for your calculator, solely because customers will go to another shop and buy it for $10 and you'll lose out on your business. So then from your $20, you'll say, okay, I'll charge 15, I'll charge 12. No, eventually you'll charge 10, like the rest of the market, as you have to compete. We assume that you're producing the same goods, so suddenly your calculator can't talk or drive cars and doesn't have a different advantage to it. So you're going to then charge what the market equilibrium is charging. You're also not going to suddenly start charging $7 for your calculator, solely because at that point people will come to you. But if people are buying calculators for $10, you might as well sell them for $10. Why would you lose out on $3 per calculator? What this actually leads to is, if we look at scenario number one, is at this point, that's the demand and that's the supply. So that means we would have excess supply. There are more people supplying the product than demanding the product. Whereas in scenario two, it would be the opposite. The demand is more than the supply. So we would have excess demand. And there'd be more people demanding the product than supplying the product. So there are ways in which you can remove excess supply and excess demand. So you can either increase the prices, decrease the prices, taxes can do it. You can have a way to maybe store your product. So companies may want the demand to always be high and the supply to be low, like the diamond industry, for example. So De Beers, please sponsor me if you can. I would absolutely love that. But they control the supply of diamonds. So by controlling the supply, there's always more demand than there is supply, which is why the price of diamonds is really, really high. And in essence, diamonds are just carbon. So it's quite difficult to imagine why they're so expensive. But it's because the supply is very, very controlled. And there you have it. That's the market equilibrium, with shifts as well, the various graphs that you may need to know, how to find the total revenue, the consumer and producer surplus, as well as why we have it.